Yeah, thanks for having me. It's funny actually, going off what Gideon was saying there about nothing or this not being new in some ways. Um, I very much agree actually, and I think it's one of the defining features of the alt-right is not necessarily that they created their own thought or their new ideas in some ways, but it was the mechanisms by which they did politics that was new. And I just dug out as he was talking in 1946. So I live on a main road. You can probably hear that ambulance. It's like it's in the room, right? Yes. So yeah, back in 1946, Jean-Paul Sartre in Anti-Semite and Jew, I dug out this quote where he says, talking of Holocaust deniers, he says, "Never believe that they are completely unaware of the absurdity of their replies. They know that their remarks are frivolous, open to challenge, but they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. The anti-Semites have the right to play. They even like to play with discourse, for by giving ridiculous reasons, they discredit the seriousness of their interlocutors. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they seek not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and disconcert. If you press them too closely, they will abruptly fall silent, loftily indicating by some phrase that that time for argument is past." And that was 1946. So I think it is just kind of worth reiterating. Lots of the discussions about the alt-right and the way they deal with anti-Semitism are not new. I'm going to talk very briefly about what I think the alt-right actually is, and then talk a bit more length about how it engages in anti-Semitism and what I think are some of the worrying or the changing nature of contemporary Holocaust denial. A lot of this research was done as part of a report we did at Hope Not Hate back in 2017, and then a book that came out last year on the alt-right. And it's a mixture of obviously open source research, but also all of the researchers involved had kind of spent time undercover within the alt-right at various times, spending time with these people to try and better understand their motives. So it's a mixture, but in terms of what I think the alt-right is, I guess, and I start with this because sometimes it is used in a remarkably broad term, which is basically anyone who's far right and alive today, or in such a narrow sense, it has to be a user of the poll board on 4chan, and so, or they have to self-identify. And of course, I think we'd all agree here that it's not either of those things. Broadly speaking, I'd define the alt-right really as a set of an international set, and I think that's really important. An international set of individuals that operate primarily online. And of course, as we've seen on numerous occasions, they have offline outlets, organizations, and they have operated offline. And this kind of mass of different individuals and groups have a set of core beliefs, which I think make them alt-right. And that is that essentially white identity is under attack from pro-multiculturalism and liberal elites, or what they would call social justice warriors, who allegedly use political correctness to undermine Western civilization and the rights of white males. And there, I think, is a core set of beliefs which we can kind of go around. Put simply, I guess, the alt-right is, of course, far right. It is anti-globalist in its grouping, and they perceive themselves, or would perhaps defined as a movement, are offering an alternative to traditional establishment conservatism. And they are, of course, very eclectic in nature. This constitutes parts from all. There's a huge amount of disagreement within the movement, but they all agree on a series of core things. They all disagree or reject left-wing liberal democratic cultural hegemony, as they would see it, and the rights that essentially derive from that. So kind of what kind of Jared Taylor in the alt-right, one of the leading American figures within the alt-right, calls the dangerous myth of equality. And in practice, this means an opposition to the rights of women, LGBT people, ethnic and religious minorities, or in some cases, a profession to agree with those rights, but to disagree with the movements that profess them. So feminism, for example. Now, I'd love to be able to give you a nice, simple start date and say, I think the alt-right started here. I don't think it works like that. It's very much an amorphous movement that best, I think, actually understood it. Actually, what was kind of talked about earlier, actually, in terms of it being, I think, a conglomerate movement is the best way of understanding it. And I would divide the movement essentially, or conceptualize the movement as neither a brand new or unique movement, but I think it is a distinct far-right movement. And I think it's a combination of the American far-right or the American extreme far-right, or the alternative rights, the non-conservative, essentially non-Republican far-right, which is a very broad collection from the Klan to neo-Nazis, combined with European new right, so European new right thought, so Nouvelle Droite, 1968 onwards, de Benoit, these kind of notions of meta-politics as an approach, culture being upstream from politics. And then really important for defining what the alt-right is this third kind of conglomerate bit, which I Hope Not Hate we call an online antagonistic communities. And so when you have this type of, this melding of American far right with European far right thought, with this specific way of doing politics on online antagonists, that's where we kind of see the alt-right having some form of distinctness. And it was, I completely agree actually that there is a whole list of neighboring online ecosystems, as was discussed earlier. The paleoconservatives, the manosphere, the neo-reactionary movement, national anarchism, survivalists, in some cases neo-Nazis, identitarians. So this is a very amorphous movement is what I'm saying. And I don't think it's a kind of specific, we can just say this is the alt-right. And the big questions remain whether or not we think the alt-right still exists in some way in the last few years. I mean, I think it does. It's just much more amorphous and decentralized. But I think if we understand it as a set of core ideas around which these various actors exist, I think we can kind of come to some sort of acceptance of what I think the alt-right is. Now, when it comes to anti-Semitism, I think there's some really interesting things to say here. But before I do, I would split the alternative right in a broad sense into what you might call the alt-right and what is sometimes termed the alt-light. And broadly speaking, the division between these two elements of the movement is there's a number of dividing points, but one of them is anti-Semitism. Broadly speaking, the alt-light, the kind of more moderate end of the movement, conceptualize the problem or the current crisis in a cultural sense. We are being invaded, the West is, the culture of the West is being undermined and crumbling. The more radical alt-right define it in a much more racial sense. It's about whiteness and it's about race. And so broadly speaking, one of those dividing lines is around anti-Semitism, in that you find much more anti-Semitism on the alt-right than you do on the alt-light. So what was being said earlier about the elements of the alt-right not being particularly preoccupied with anti-Semitism, I think it depends where you look at the alt-right, where on the spectrum we see. When I look at the more extreme end, or the more kind of orthodox alt-right, if you will, I think anti-Semitism in some ways makes up a core element of this race-obsessed kind of worldview. Many of them combine this conspiratorial belief that there is a genocide against white people with the ideas that it is being orchestrated secretly by Jews. And a lot of this is heavily influenced by the work of Kevin MacDonald, the kind of Svengali of the alt-right's anti-Semitism. But one of the things I think is really important to look at when we talk about how the alt-right do anti-Semitism and how this affects Holocaust denial, I think, is that despite there being this kind of, in some senses, this pseudo-intellectual trappings of people like MacDonald, a lot of the anti-Semitism with the alt-right, as has been mentioned, is typified by a more base, visceral, or even like a heavily ironized form of anti-Semitism. The alternative right, as has been said, developed largely online, on social media, and in certain corners of the internet and forums, such as 4chan, Pol, and those sorts of places. And within these online spaces, there is an existing online behavior, that of trolling, and there's developed a distinctly extreme, antagonistic, taboo-breaking form of political engagement. And while the alt-right activists do venerate traditional Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites and things, there is also this really base, mocking, kind of ironic, like cartoony attacks and anti-Semitism, which is really central to the way the alt-right does anti-Semitism. And I think this is how this plays out when we talk about Holocaust denial. And I think we are witnessing in the last decade or so a change in the nature of contemporary Holocaust denial. I would broadly speak it, traditionally Holocaust denial, my kind of early research was on the birth of Holocaust denial in the late 40s and 50s. And the Holocaust was so important to the people that were doing Holocaust denial at the time. It was the central of their worldview. For them, of course, their motivation was the Holocaust was the primary roadblock on the road to resurrecting fascism in the late 1940s and 50s. If you wanted to resurrect fascism, you had to remove the Holocaust. And then we have the kind of what you might call the heyday of Holocaust denial, the 70s, 80s, etc. And you have these major figures, some of which have been mentioned: David Irving, Ernst Zundel, Fred Leuchtter, Robert Farrison. And this group essentially sought academic credibility and mainstream acceptance. They created fake titles, they wrote pseudo-academic and pseudo-scientific books. They attempted to disprove the historical record of the Holocaust through forms of almost pseudo-academic research. In some ways, this scene has gone into a real decline in the last decade or so, partly because so many of them are dying or dead. Robert Farrison died in 2018. I mean, if you go see David Irving speak now, when he used to fill lecture theatres in Germany and Britain, pretty large audiences. I saw David Irving speak a few years ago for Hope Not Hate, we went along and there were 6 of us in the room. So the days when he could attract these big audiences, some of these big figures don't exist. And of course, a lot of that crowd has died out and has not been rejuvenated in its traditional form. The powerhouses of the traditional Holocaust denial scene, while some are still around, they really are a shadow of them former selves. In its places, we've seen this kind of more modern, younger form of Holocaust denial, primarily perpetrated online. And I think coming with this, tapped into this kind of alt-right notion of doing politics and being ultra extreme, ultra ironic, has changed in some of the ways we're seeing Holocaust denial happen. Now, of course, we're still seeing the very traditional Holocaust denial. We still have massive tombs being published every year by things like the Committee for the Open Debate of the Holocaust, etc., that are doing the same things. They're questioning where the gas chambers were, they're questioning the holes in the roof, they're questioning the gas in the walls, all of this sort of stuff. But there is this newer form of this kind of much more flippant form of Holocaust denial. And I think there's a few examples I just wanted to touch on. Back in 2018, there was a website called the Daily Stormer, which of course in many ways was just a really extreme neo-Nazi website, but Andrew Anglin classed it as part of the alt-right, and in some ways it fit within that milieu and was on the most extreme end of the alt-right. And there's a famous Holocaust denier called Michelle Renouf that many of you may have heard of. She's still around, she's still causing problems. One of the major figures in the scene of the more traditional Holocaust denial scene. And she was up in court after allegedly a speech she made against a neo-Nazi rally in Dresden in Germany that month. And there was an article in the Daily Stormer, and the article embedded a video of Frederick Leuchtter speaking at this revisionist or so-called revisionist conference back in the early 90s. Now, Frederick Leuchtter is one of these people that claimed to be an engineer but had no academic record in that area and had no qualifications. But in that speech, he declared that he goes, "I am an engineer and a scientist, not a revisionist. But because of what I have seen, have a responsibility to the truth. Because of this responsibility, I'm calling for an international commission of scientists, historians, and scholars." Here we see a very traditional form of Holocaust denial. It's about truth. It's about the scientific method. It's wrapped up in this pseudo-academic style. But if you look at how the Daily Stormer wrote that up, they said, despite kind of essentially promulgating content from this traditional Holocaust scene, the Daily Stormer had a style guide that got leaked. And in it, it extols the value of what they call being focused on lulls, essentially being humorous and eschewing grandiosity, encouraging the avoidance of what they call college words, for example. So if you look at how they wrote the article up, it says about Renouf, it says, "British woman investigated for denying kooky fake shower room hoax." Here we see this kind of clash between the different styles. Frederick Leuchtter, who's attempting to come across as a scientist, who's disproving historical records, and the Daily Stormer that's talking about kooky fake shower room hoaxes. Even the most extreme Holocaust deniers of the 40s and 50s in the UK, like Arnold Lees, took the Holocaust seriously, even if they said it didn't happen. But the way they wrote about it was far more serious. Many in the alt-right simultaneously deny or celebrate the Holocaust and have really little interest in feigning seriousness in the same way. Another quick example before I finish. I mean, there was a blog on the website, on the Daily Stormer, which said how you could debunk the Holocaust in 140 characters or less. And then finally, there's a guy called Mike Pinovich, or Mike Enoch, that some of you may have heard of, a very, very extreme far-right figure in North America. Again, at his heyday would have been classed as part of the alt-right. On Holocaust Memorial Day in 2018, he tweeted, "Here's the thing, Jews, real or fake, I don't give a fuck about the Holocaust," okay? Now, the reason I say that is because that's such a different approach to the way that traditional Holocaust denial or Holocaust, talking about the Holocaust, was done by the far right, because the Holocaust was so important, because it was the roadblock to the resurrection of fascism. It had to be dealt with seriously, even if it was denied. This kind of much more dismissive tone is something we're increasingly seeing. So just to kind of tie this all up, I guess, in some ways what I'm saying is there is a new, younger, anonymous and resource denial movement that we're looking at. The traditional scene has been overtaken by a younger, more tech-savvy generation of anti-Semites who are more adept at propagandizing online. Also, this has kind of been touched upon. The access and the ease with which you can find Holocaust denial content online is unprecedented. If you think back to what I talk about, the high point of the traditional Holocaust denial scene, you primarily had to buy books from the far right. You had to write off to book lists. You had to contact them. You knew you were getting Holocaust denial literature from a far-right publisher. Very little of it would creep into mainstream bookshops. Of course, the internet has changed all that. Hope Not Hate ran a campaign a few years ago about asking major bookstores like Waterstones, Foyles, Amazon, you name it, to not stock Holocaust denial, and we're greeted with a kind of "what about free speech" argument. So I think this has become just much more accessible. And outside of those traditional shops, it's just a wash. You can go on any social media platform and find it. You can type in the name of a Holocaust denial book and you'll find the PDF. So it's easier to access. It's also done anonymously in some ways, of course. The nature of the internet means it's possible to be active in denial circles completely anonymously. The social cost of activism and Holocaust denial can be much lower for people than, say, turning up at an event, being photographed, putting in a newspaper, anti-fascists putting your picture in an anti-fascist magazine, etc. You can do that. You can sit in your bedroom anywhere in the world and send anti-Semitic hate to a Jewish MP in Australia or Germany or America. You can deny the Holocaust, and you can do it behind an avatar that means you'll never get caught, which makes the laws around Holocaust denial increasingly impossible to deal with. I also think there is this younger element. When we talk about the alt-right, yes, of course, there's figures from all age groups in it, many of which the older members have reconstituted themselves as alt-right. But a lot of the younger people that identify it, in some ways, it was a younger movement, many people in their 20s. And the final point I guess I want to touch on here is the historicization of the Holocaust. And for many of the people in the alt-right and that we monitor at Hope Not Hate, we're increasingly finding far-right activists and neo-Nazi activists that are 12, 13, 14, 15. The Holocaust is ancient history, right? It's like talking to them about the Napoleonic Wars. And so you have this paradox whereby the Holocaust has become historicized, it's become part of history, it's disappeared into the distance of history. And yet they are part of a movement which venerates causing outrage, and they know full well that denying the Holocaust and being anti-Semitic causes and continues to cause public outrage. So you combine those two things, a historical event that most of them don't care about, know it with the belief that they can cause outrage by denying it. You can see why this is such an attractive topic for members of the contemporary, younger far right. They can deny the Holocaust, get all of the outrage they want, and they're denying something they have no interest in. Most of the children that we talk about, or the younger activists in the far right now that we monitor at Hope Not Hate, huge chunks of them were born after 9/11. The Second World War is ancient history. You know, they live in a post 9/11 world. So causing offense is important, troll culture is important, antagonistic online behavior is important, and the Holocaust fits in that. So finally, I guess, anti-Semitism, the memes that were talked about, the happy merchant, the echoes, these are archetypal of the way that the alt-right has adopted centuries-old anti-Semitic tropes and sought to reinvent them for a new and younger generation. That is heavily inflicted by the internet culture in which many within the alt-right emerged, a culture that venerates and encourages offense. The alt-right's anti-Semitism is not unique, I think that's clear, in form, but it is essentially new in style in some ways. However, whether it is humorous anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic memes, the shocking casualness with which you'll hear them talk about the Holocaust, or the consciously extreme language of the sites like the Daily Stormer, the alt-right and anti-Semitism is essentially, I would argue, old wine in new bottles, I guess is how I'd kind of describe it. But thank you.